A few months ago, I uploaded a video where I built a Windows gaming PC on a $100 budget. It was a pretty basic system with an i3-4130 and an NVIDIA Quadro K620, which is mainly suited for older games and esports titles at lower settings. In that video, I also suggested some alternative components that, with a slightly higher budget, would offer better performance. Today, I'm revisiting the $100 budget to build something even more capable. My goal is to find another OEM pre-built system and then add a graphics card and any other necessary components, all for under $100 US. I'll be looking for deals that are possible for others to replicate, but as always, finding the best bargains requires time, patience, and a bit of luck. For this build, I was able to find almost everything I needed on eBay, with just a few minor exceptions. Keep in mind that I'm based in the United States, so the availability and the prices of used PC hardware may vary significantly depending on where you live. Also, I've included the cost of shipping and taxes in the total price. The first and most important step was finding an OEM pre-built office PC with a solid baseline of specs and components to build around. Last time I went with a small form factor Dell Optiplex that supported Intel's 4th gen Haswell processors. This time I aimed for a mini tower or full tower with a slightly newer platform. This offers more upgrade potential and better overall compatibility, which is really helpful when trying to put together something for cheap. During my search, I was able to find an HP EliteDesk 800G2 tower with an i5-6500, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, and a 1TB HDD. The listing was priced at $50 plus $14.81 for shipping. I was actually pretty surprised when the seller accepted my very low offer of just $32, bringing the total cost to $49.82. This was an ideal find as it provided almost all the core components we needed right from the start, saving a lot of money compared to buying them separately. Deals like this are pretty rare and can be difficult to replicate, but as I mentioned earlier, with a bit of time, patience, and luck, it's possible to find great bargains on sites like eBay. When I received the system, I was pleased to find that everything had been cleaned and well maintained by the seller. To my surprise, there were actually two 1TB drives included, along with the 16GB of RAM, which was made up of two 8GB DIMMs in dual channel configuration. I also took a look at the power supply, which is rated for a maximum of 280 watts, providing plenty of headroom for adding additional components. The i5-6500 in this system is a Skylake processor with 4 cores and 4 threads. While it's not a particularly modern chip, having been released back in 2015, it should still perform well for an ultra-budget build like this. Although this generation of Intel processors isn't a huge leap over the older Haswells I've used before, we do have the option to upgrade to higher performing CPUs like the i7-6700 if needed. With the remaining $50 of the budget, I decided to tackle the storage situation first. My goal was to replace one of the HDDs with a smaller SSD to improve boot times and overall navigation in Windows 10. I went with a Patriot P210 SATA SSD with a 256GB capacity, which I found for Amazon for just $18 after taxes. This should work well as a fast boot drive, and combined with the 1TB HDD, it gives us plenty of room for some games and programs. For the graphics card, I had about $32 left to work with, which definitely limited my options. It was a bit of a challenge, but I enjoyed the hunt and managed to find not one, but two decent alternative graphics cards that fit within the budget. Once again, I turned to eBay and found an AMD Radeon RX 460. The seller accepted my offer of $22, bringing the total to $23.21 after tax. The RX 460 is a GPU I've covered on the channel before, and was once a go-to choice for super budget builds. It can be tough to find one for under $35 to $40, so I definitely consider myself lucky to score this deal. The RX 460 is a GCN 4.0 GPU released in 2016, and the version I got is a 2GB MSI OC model, which looks much nicer than the typical red OEM cards you often see. The other graphics card I managed to snag was an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 950, which I got for just $26.38 after another successful low offer. The GTX 950 is a Maxwell 2.0 GPU from 2015 with 2GB of VRAM. Both cards I picked up have a low TDP, so they'll work well with the 280W PSU. However, the GTX 950 does require supplemental power via a 6-pin connector, which our OEM power supply does not have. To solve this, I purchased a 2-pack of SATA to 6 plus 2-pin connectors for $7.40 on Amazon. Since I only need one, I've added just $3.70 to the total cost for the GTX 950 build. In terms of relative performance, the GTX 950 should be a slightly more capable card between the two. As an added bonus, the GTX 900 series still receives driver updates as of the time of this video. while support for the RX 460 has already ended. This probably won't make a huge difference since the primary use for these cards is older titles, but it's still worth noting. In total, going with the RX 460 came to $91.03, while the GTX 950 build ended up at $97.90. The deals I managed to get here were pretty ideal, and I could see a more typical, easily repeatable build with similar specs coming in around $15 to $20 more. But as I mentioned before, finding the best deals isn't always convenient or easy, so I definitely felt rewarded for my effort with such an affordable total cost. The next step after assembling the system was to test it out in a few games to see what it's capable of. My expectations weren't too high, but I expected better performance than that of my last $100 build. The goal was to achieve decent stability and ideally get around 60 FPS or more in most games, with as much graphical fidelity as possible. With a build like this, low settings and upscaling will likely be necessary, and 1080p is the highest native resolution we can realistically aim for. For these tests, I'll be running both GPUs at the same settings to compare their performance. First up, I tested CS2 in 1080p at the medium preset. In a Dust 2 bot match, the RX 460 averaged a pretty stable 102 FPS with only a few noticeable drops. The GTX 950 on the other hand averaged 97 FPS, but was a bit more stable as reflected in the percentile lows. For GTA 5 running at 1080p with all settings on high, the GTX 950 performed better with an average of 95 FPS over about 10 minutes of testing. The RX 460 trailed by about 20%, averaging 76 FPS. However, at these settings, both cards perform well enough to get the job done. They'd probably be able to push higher settings if they weren't limited by the 2GB of onboard VRAM. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I ran the benchmarking tool with the favorite performance preset at 1080p. This turned out to be a significant jump in demand for these GPUs. The RX 460 averaged just 31 FPS, while the GTX 950 pulled ahead with an average of 38 FPS. For some, this could still be playable if you're okay with the lower visual quality. While not ideal, it's worth noting that this is a fairly modern title compared to our 8 and 9-year-old cards. Cyberpunk 2077 produced similar results overall. At 1080p with the low settings and FSR set to performance, both the RX 460 and GTX 950 gave extremely similar performance after about 10 minutes of driving around Night City. To me, the visuals still hold up well even with the FSR upscaling, and this game ran remarkably better than it did on my last $100 build that I shared. In one of my favorite games, Baldur's Gate 3, the system was really pushed to its limits at low settings with FSR 2.2 set to performance. This game is very CPU intensive and can have fluctuating graphical demands depending on the in-game environments. In the Rivington area, which has a lot of NPCs, CPU usage was near 100% much of the time. That said, the RX 460 averaged FPS in the low 30s to the low 40s, while the GTX 950 had a slightly higher average. However, I did notice a few sharper drops in FPS with the GTX 950, even though I tested both cards on nearly identical paths in the game. While the textures and overall visual clarity were quite poor, I did notice that the GTX 950 performed better during cutscenes, with sharper visuals, better lighting effects, and more detailed textures. I even compared a screenshot from the same cutscene at 1440p on ultra settings, and while there was a clear difference, the $100 system still held up pretty well. When you consider that the entire PC costs just 1/8 of what my 4070 Ti Super is worth alone, it's impressive how much performance you can squeeze out of a budget build like this. The last benchmark I ran was in Black Myth Wukong. This is definitely not a game you'd expect to run well on a system like this, but it's still interesting to see how bad it will look. Even at 1080p with FSR set to the lowest render resolution, neither GPU could consistently hit 25 FPS. To get at least 30 FPS, I had to drop the resolution to 720p with a 1/3 render resolution, effectively making the output a very low 240p before being upscaled. At these settings, the RX 460 averaged 31 FPS, while the GTX 950 managed a smoother 40 FPS. So if you were planning on playing Wukong with either of these cards, good luck. Overall, this sub $100 gaming PC really punches above its weight in some older titles, especially when you consider the cost and the age of the components. As I often recommend in these kinds of videos, this type of build isn't something I'd suggest unless someone knows exactly what games and programs they want to run and is confident this setup will meet their needs. In most cases, I'd advise someone to save up a bit more, perhaps $300 to $400, and build something with slightly newer components that's more capable and offers a better upgrade path in the future. Anyways, I had a lot of fun deal hunting and putting together this sub $100 PC before testing it in a few games. Like I did in my last $100 build video, I plan to upgrade the system soon and share how I went about doing it. If you want to stay tuned for that, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Also, if you have any questions, suggestions, or recommendations for ways I can upgrade this system, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching.